The alarm on Ruth Carver's nightstand read 4:47 in the morning, but she was already awake. She had been awake since 4, lying flat on her back in the dark bedroom, with her hands folded across her chest, listening to the soft groan of the old house
We need you to move by the end of the week.
The ceiling
offer
was
is more than
familiar
fair.
in its cracks
I'm
and
not
shadows.
going anywhere.
She had
You can keep your
memorized
papers.
every one of them over the course of 41 years, sleeping in this room, first beside Earl, then alone. 3 years alone now. The empty side of the mattress had long stopped feeling like a wound. It had become something quieter than that, a fact. The kind of fact you learn to carry the same way you carry the weight of your own bones. She rose without ceremony. Her feet found the floor, her hands found the lamp switch, and the small bedroom filled with warm amber light that caught the framed photograph on the dresser. Earl in his fishing hat, squinting into the California sun, holding up a striped bass that was probably smaller than he remembered it being. She touched the corner of the frame the way she touched it every morning. A greeting, a check-in with the man she had spent 41 years beside, the man she missed every morning and every evening, and most of the hours in between. Then she dressed in her uniform, dark jeans pressed sharp the night before, a white short-sleeved shirt, and the burgundy apron she had worn so long, the strings had been replaced twice, and the fabric had gone soft in a way that new aprons never are. Ruth Carver's roadside diner sat on the shoulder of Route 99, 6 miles outside the city limits of Bakersfield proper. It was a low, wide building with a tin roof the color of old rust, and a hand-painted sign above the door that Earl had lettered himself back in 1987. The R in Ruth had a slight wobble in it because Earl had sneezed mid-stroke and refused to redo it on the grounds that perfection was overrated in signage, as in everything else. She had never asked him to fix it. She had loved it immediately and had never stopped. She drove the 2-lane access road in her pickup in the thick dark of pre-dawn, the headlights cutting through low ground fog that rose off the irrigation ditches on either side. The fields beyond stretched flat and enormous into the dark, the smell of dry earth and distant citrus coming in through the cracked window. She unlocked the front door at 5:15, the same as every morning except Christmas and the day Earl died. She hit the lights in sequence, kitchen first, then the main floor, then the neon sign in the window that read, "Open," in red and cast a faint pink glow across the gravel parking lot. The diner had 14 booths, a counter with 8 stools, a pass-through to the kitchen, and 3 ceiling fans that turned all year because the air conditioning had trouble with the lunch rush. Every surface Ruth had cleaned the night before. Every sugar dispenser had been refilled. The salt and pepper shakers stood in pairs, straight and attentive, like small soldiers waiting for orders. Her cook, Pete Garland, arrived at 5:30. He was a heavy-set man of 52 who had worked a grill for 11 years and communicated primarily in grunts that Ruth had long ago decoded into an entire language. 2 short grunts meant the delivery order was short again. 1 long grunt with a sigh meant the industrial dishwasher was acting up. A single grunt and a nod meant everything was running fine and there was fresh coffee already poured. This morning she got the nod and the coffee, which was the best possible version of a Tuesday. Danny came in at 6:15, still pulling on his apron strings, his dark hair uncombed, his eyes carrying the particular blurred look of a young man who had stayed up too late studying. He was 24 and wore his age loosely, the way young men do when they haven't yet learned how fast it moves. He kissed Ruth on the cheek at the pass-through window, and she handed him a to-go cup without a word, because this was also part of the morning ritual, part of the language that a mother and son develop over years of working the same space together. "Table 4 needs a new ketchup bottle," she told him. "There's one on the second shelf in the back." "Already on it," he said, and disappeared into the storage room. She watched him go with a particular combination of pride and worry that had defined her relationship with her only child for as long as she could remember. Danny had Earl's jaw and Ruth's stubbornness, which meant he was handsome and nearly impossible to redirect once he'd made up his mind. He was 2 semesters from finishing his associate's degree in business administration at Bakersfield Community College. He had plans, real plans, the kind that involved leaving this diner and doing something entirely his own. Ruth had never told him to stay. She had also never told him how much she was quietly counting the days until those plans pulled him away. And she never would, because it was not her place to weigh his future against her comfort. The morning rush built steadily. By 7:30, every stool at the counter was occupied, and 5 of the 14 booths were full. Ruth knew each face. Charlie Moss drove a produce truck and always ordered the same thing: 2 eggs, over easy, wheat toast, black coffee, no conversation. Doris Flagg was a retired school teacher who brought a paperback novel she never actually read, using it as a prop to avoid the aggressive small talk of the booth behind her. Jean Puckett had worked the night shift at the grain elevator and smelled like dust and effort, and always tipped $2 no matter what he ordered. These were Ruth's people. They had been coming here for decades. Some of them had sat on these same stools when Earl was still alive, and they had come back after the funeral, and they had kept coming the way people keep returning to places that know them without requiring explanation. It was the kind of loyalty that does not get talked about, only demonstrated 1 cup of coffee at a time. At 9:15, after the morning rush had thinned to a comfortable murmur of late risers and the 2 retired men who played chess at the corner booth every Tuesday, the door opened and a man Ruth did not know walked in. He was perhaps 45, trim in pressed khaki trousers and a blue Oxford shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. His shoes were expensive. His haircut was expensive. His watch made a quiet declaration of net worth. He surveyed the diner the way a contractor surveys a building he has already decided to tear down, his gaze moving methodically from the ceiling fans to the floor tiles to the lunch counter without landing on any person inside. He took a seat at the counter. Ruth poured his coffee before he asked for it, because that was what she did for everyone. He wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at her directly. "You're Ruth Carver," he said. It was not a question. "Last I checked," she said. She already did not like him in the particular way that Ruth Carver had never liked men who made statements when they meant to ask questions. "Grant Holloway," he said, and offered his hand across the counter. She shook it once briefly. "I'm a developer. I have a number of projects in the valley, and I'm putting together something significant in this corridor. I've been watching this property for about 2 years. He paused here, she assumed for effect. "I'd like to make you an offer. I'm not selling." He smiled patiently, as though she had said something charming rather than something final. "You haven't heard the number. Doesn't matter. Mrs. Carver, I'm prepared to offer you $850,000 for this property and the land it sits on. That's significantly above assessed value. You could retire completely. No more early mornings. No more—" "Mr. Holloway," Ruth said, and her voice was calm and flat and final as a period at the end of a sentence. "This diner has been in my family for 37 years. My husband built the counter you're sitting at with his own 2 hands. I buried him 3 years ago, and I came back to work 5 days later because this place is not a business to me. It is my life. I'm not selling it to you or anyone else." She refilled his coffee without asking. "Is there something you'd like to eat?" A beat passed. Something moved behind his eyes, a recalculation, a reassessment of the obstacle in front of him. Then he smiled again, and this time the patience in it was thinner, more practiced. "I'll have the eggs," he said. Scrambled. He ate without speaking, left a 20 on the counter for a $12 meal, and walked out without looking back. Ruth watched his Land Rover pull out of the gravel lot and took a slow breath. She had met men like Grant Holloway before, men who wore patience like a suit and kept the pressure underneath it hidden until they were ready to use it. She folded the 20 into the register and told herself to put him out of her mind. She almost managed it. The late morning settled into the comfortable rhythm that Ruth Carver had lived inside for most of her adult life. The chess players at the corner booth staged their quiet war. Pete moved through the kitchen with the practiced economy of a man who had performed the same motions 10,000 times. Danny refilled coffees and called out booth numbers with the slightly too loud confidence of a young man trying to look more alert than he felt. Ruth moved between the counter in the kitchen and the register in a circuit she could have run blind reading the room, the way a ship captain reads water, not consciously, but through the accumulated intelligence of long experience. It was 11:48 when the front door opened and the man walked in. He was enormous, 6'4" at the minimum, with a frame that looked like it had been assembled from timber rather than bone, all heavy shoulder and thick neck, and the kind of hands that could palm a basketball without effort. He wore a black leather vest over a gray thermal shirt, and the vest was covered front and back with patches of the kind Ruth recognized even from across the room. The kind that told you this man belonged to something larger than himself, and had the marks to prove it. The center patch on the back was a skull with wings, and below it the words, Iron Riders, and below that, Bakersfield, California. His name, though, Ruth did not yet know it was Wade Steele. The men who rode with him called him Grizzly, and the name fit him the way most good nicknames fit, not because it was particularly original, but because it was accurate. At 58, Wade had the face of a man who had been broken and healed and broken again, a face that had made peace with its own damage. He had been riding since he was 19, had buried 3 brothers, had sat at more hospital bedsides than he cared to count, and had served as vice president of the Iron Riders Bakersfield Charter for 11 years, under the quiet authority of Cole Decker, their president. But none of that history was visible to Ruth as he pushed through the door. What was visible was the way he moved. He was holding himself upright by will alone. That was what she clocked first, the way a woman who had lived 11 years beside a diabetic husband clocks it. The locked jaw, the waxy sheen on the forehead, the slight overcorrection in balance, the way his eyes were open but not quite focused, doing the work of 2 eyes, trying to be 4. He gripped the back of the nearest booth as he passed it, his knuckles whitening, and she watched his chest rise in shallow, too rapid increments. She knew exactly what she was looking at. Earl had gone down 4 times in 41 years, twice at the diner, once at home, once in the parking lot of a hardware store on a hot August afternoon when the low blood sugar had come on fast without warning. Each time Ruth had been the one to recognize it before he himself understood what was happening. The hypoglycemic crash came fast, and it came without announcement, and if you didn't know what you were looking at, you could mistake it for anything. Exhaustion, heat, too much sun. If you knew what you were looking at, you had maybe 3 minutes before the body stopped cooperating entirely. Wade made it to the end booth and lowered himself into the seat with the careful deliberateness of a man who understands he is in serious trouble. He fumbled at the inside pocket of his vest, searching. His hands were trembling. He found nothing. Ruth was already moving. She went through the pass-through into the kitchen, took the orange juice from the reach-in cooler, full quart, not a small glass, the full quart, and grabbed the sugar canister from the prep shelf. She was at Wade's table in 40 seconds. "Look at me," she said, and her voice was the voice of a woman who had given this instruction before and needed it followed immediately. His eyes found her working to focus. "Do you have glucose tablets, candy, anything sweet in your pockets?" He shook his head slowly. "Okay, drink this." She poured a full glass of orange juice and put it directly in his hand, closed his fingers around the glass, and guided it upward. "All of it. Don't stop drinking." He drank. The glass came down. She poured another. "I'm calling an ambulance," she said. He raised one massive hand in a vague protest, the universal gesture of a man who does not want to make a fuss. "You can argue with me in about 15 minutes when you have enough blood sugar to form a complete sentence," Ruth told him. "Right now you are going to drink and sit still." Danny had appeared at her shoulder, reading the situation with the quick instinct of someone who had grown up watching his mother respond to exactly this. "I'll call," he said, and was already heading for the counterphone. Ruth kept her full attention on Wade. She watched his color. She watched his hands for the trembling to slow. She tilted 3 teaspoons of sugar into the second glass of juice and made him drink that too, guiding his hand again when he began to lower it before the glass was empty. She was not alarmed in the clinical sense. She was focused. This was not a situation that called for alarm. It called for competence, and Ruth Carver had more than enough of that. The 3 young men came in at 12:02. They were loud before they were visible, their voices carrying through the door ahead of them, a specific kind of loud, the volume of young men performing for each other, competing through noise to establish hierarchy. They were in their early 20s, athletic, dressed in the casual, expensive way of young men whose parents paid for everything without requiring gratitude in return. The one in front was the tallest, wide through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been called handsome enough times that it had become a form of armor against self-examination. He scanned the room with the reflexive territorial assessment of someone who expected to be the most important person in any given space. His name was Derek Holloway. His friends were Kyle Roark and Bryce Lund. They were day drinking, not drunk, not yet, but the particular looseness in their movement and the overconfidence in their voices suggested they had started early and intended to continue through the afternoon. Derek's eyes moved across the room and stopped when they landed on Wade. Ruth noticed it, the way something sharpened in Derek's expression, the involuntary curling at the corner of his mouth that came from recognizing vulnerability in someone he wanted to diminish. She had seen that look before. Different face, same arithmetic. She placed herself between Derek's line of sight and Wade's table and moved toward the 3 men before they could take another step. "Find a booth," she said, keeping her voice pleasant and her posture absolute. "I'll be right with you." Derek looked at her for a moment with the patient non-expression of a young man who had learned to look at service workers as scenery. Then he looked past her at Wade. "What's wrong with him?" "Medical situation," Ruth said. "There's a booth right behind you, gentlemen." "Doesn't look medical," Kyle said, and there was a snicker from Bryce. "Looks like maybe he had a few too many for lunch," Derek said, stepping to the side to see around her. "Big bad biker can't hold it together. That's embarrassing." Ruth moved with him squarely in front of him again, not aggressively, but with the unmistakable posture of a woman who owned every square inch of floor she was standing on. "He is diabetic and in medical distress, and there is an ambulance on the way. I need you 3 to take a seat." Derek looked at her with something that was not quite contempt, but was its first cousin. He was not accustomed to being redirected by a woman in an apron. He showed it the way men like him always show it, not by raising his voice, but by ignoring what she had said entirely, as though she had not spoken at all. He walked around her. He moved to Wade's booth, and Ruth followed immediately and put herself between Derek and the table, with her back to Wade and her face to Derek. And she said very quietly and very clearly, "You are not going to do this in my diner." Derek looked down at her from his significant height advantage and smiled the smile of a young man who has not yet been taught that certain women do not move. "Lady," he said, "you need to mind your business." "This is my business," Ruth said, "literally every inch of it." "Hey!" He raised his voice toward Wade, who was slumped against the window, his eyes half closed, color only beginning to return to his face from the orange juice. "Hey, big man, you hear me? You look pathetic. You know that big, tough biker can't even sit up straight?" Wade's eyes opened partway. He registered the voice from a great distance, the way a drowning man registers the sound of a boat engine, close enough to hear too far gone to signal. Kyle laughed. Bryce reached past Ruth and shoved Wade's shoulder. The big man rocked sideways, his head lolling against the window glass. Ruth said nothing. She put her hand flat on Bryce's chest and pushed. Not hard, firmly, with the unambiguous language of a woman who was done talking and had moved on to action. Bryce stumbled back a step more from surprise than force, his face going red with the particular outrage of someone who had not expected a 68-year-old woman to put her hands on him. "Lady," Derek said, and his voice had dropped to something colder. I said, mind your own. He grabbed Ruth's arm above the elbow. Not a gentle correction, a grip, the kind designed to move her out of the way by demonstrating that he was capable of it. What happened next happened fast. Ruth pulled her arm back reflexively. Her heel caught the base of Wade's booth, and she went down sideways, her hip and the back of her skull connecting with the edge of the lunch counter in a single sharp crack that rang through the diner like something had broken. The sugar canister she'd been holding hit the linoleum and sprayed white across the floor. The sound of the impact stopped everything in the room. Doris Flagg gasped and rose halfway from her booth, her unread paperback falling to the floor. Charlie Moss was already on his feet at the counter, moving with the unhurried purpose of a man who has spent 30 years deciding when to act. Pete Garland appeared at the kitchen window, his expression communicating clearly that there was no version of this situation in which he was going to stand still. Ruth was down. Not unconscious, but down on the linoleum, her elbow braced her vision, white at the edges from the impact. And there was a hard electric pain radiating up from the back of her skull that she would later describe as the feeling of being struck by something that did not ask permission. Danny came through the pass-through at a dead run. He was 24 years old and not a large man, but he had his mother's stubbornness and the sudden, bright animal rage of a son who has just watched his mother fall. He put himself between Derek and Ruth without hesitation and caught Derek's collar with both hands before the larger man could step backward. And what followed was brief and entirely one-sided in terms of physical outcome. Derek was bigger and athletic and had the reflex advantage of someone who had been in fights before and won them. Danny took a fist to the jaw that rocked his head sideways and a second one to the ribs that folded him, but he held on. Kyle grabbed Danny from behind. Bryce put his boot in. Ruth was pulling herself upright against the counter edge, her vision clearing her hand, finding the telephone receiver by instinct. She dialed 911 with steady hands. Her voice, when the dispatcher picked up, was measured and clear. "This is Ruth Carver at the roadside diner on Route 99, 6 miles east of Bakersfield. I need an ambulance for a man in diabetic crisis and police for an assault in progress. Right now." She gave the address. She set the receiver down without hanging up, leaving the line open, the dispatcher's voice still audible in the room. Then she went to her son. The three men pulled back when Ruth came around the counter, not because they were frightened of her specifically, but because the dispatcher's voice was still audible, confirming units dispatched, and because Charlie Moss had positioned himself between the three young men and the Carvers with the measured, unhurried movement of a former Marine who has decided he has heard enough. He did not touch anyone. He simply stood there and folded his arms and looked at Derek with the expression of a man who has nothing in the world to prove and nothing left to lose. And that expression was sufficient. Derek looked at Charlie. He looked at Pete in the kitchen window. He looked at the open phone line. The calculation was visible on his face, running fast. "This is a misunderstanding," Derek said. "Get out of my diner," Ruth told him. She was kneeling beside Danny, her hand at the back of his head, her eyes reading his face for concussion signs. His lip was split and his jaw was beginning to swell, but his eyes were tracking, and his words when he tried to speak were clear enough. Derek started toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back once his face arranged into something approximating calm. "This isn't over," he said. Ruth did not look up from her son. The ambulance arrived in 11 minutes. The paramedics worked on Wade with practiced efficiency, running the IV line, checking his blood pressure, confirming through his wallet medical alert card that he was type 1 diabetic. His blood glucose had dropped to 31 when they measured it. Another 20 minutes without intervention, and he would have been in a coma. The paramedic who reported the number looked at Ruth and said matter-of-factly that whoever had gotten juice and sugar into him had made the difference. Ruth said nothing to this. She had done what was in front of her to do, and that was the end of it as far as she was concerned. The second paramedic team checked the back of Ruth's head, A significant contusion. No laceration, no signs of concussion, though they recommended a follow-up with her doctor. She declined the follow-up on the grounds that she was fine and had a lunch service to finish. By the time the paramedics were loading Wade onto the stretcher, his eyes were open and focused, and he was looking across the diner floor to where Ruth sat on the bottom step of the back hall with her hand on Danny's arm, talking to him quietly in the low, steady voice she had used since he was small to talk him through difficult things. Wade watched her for a long moment. She had taken a hard fall, and she was sitting straight, and her eyes were clear, and she was not talking about herself at all. 2 patrol officers arrived and took statements. Ruth gave hers patiently and precisely the way she did everything. She described the grip on her arm and the fall and what had happened to Danny. Charlie Moss and Doris Flagg confirmed the account. The officers photographed Danny's face and the counter edge where Ruth had struck her head and the scuff marks on the floor. It was the older of the 2 officers who took a call while they were still inside the diner. Ruth watched him step outside, his posture changing as he listened. He was out there for 3 minutes. When he came back in, something had shifted in his face. Not guilt exactly, but the specific discomfort of a man who has just been given an instruction he does not entirely agree with and is choosing to follow it anyway. "Mrs. Carver," he said carefully, "given the circumstances, the medical emergency, the confusion of the situation, we're going to issue a report and pursue this through proper channels. The young men have been contacted and instructed to come in for questioning." Ruth looked at him. "They assaulted my son and knocked me to the floor. I understand that, and we take it seriously. Without clear video documentation, we're looking at conflicting accounts." "There were 5 witnesses," she said. "Yes, ma'am, and their statements are recorded in the report." She looked past him through the window. In the parking lot, a Land Rover had pulled up alongside the patrol cars. Grant Holloway stood beside it with his phone to his ear, watching the diner with the expression of a man reviewing a situation he has recently called in a favor about. Ruth looked back at the officer. He did not quite meet her eyes. She understood then, with the clarity of a woman who had spent 68 years watching how power moved in small towns, exactly what had happened. She thanked the officer for coming out and walked him to the door and watched both patrol cars leave. Through the window, she watched Grant Holloway's Land Rover pull out of the lot behind them. Danny came to stand beside his mother at the window. His jaw was swollen, and his lip had stopped bleeding, and he looked in this moment very young. "You okay?" he asked her. "My head hurts," she said honestly. "What do you want to do?" Ruth looked at the empty parking lot. She thought about Earl. She thought about 37 years of early mornings, and the faces of people who had been sitting at her counter so long they were more familiar to her than most of her relatives. She thought about the wobble in the R. She thought about the particular quality of things built to last. "I want to finish the lunch service," she said. "Then we'll figure out the rest." She turned away from the window and picked up the coffee pot and began her circuit. The ambulance carrying Wade Steele left the Route 99 parking lot at 12:58. As the doors closed, Wade turned his head and looked through the small rear window back at the diner. The neon "open" sign was still lit in the window. Through the glass, he could just make out the shape of a woman in a white shirt and burgundy apron moving between tables, pouring coffee, rebuilding the ordinary calm of the room she owned. He had been in bad shape when she found him, worse than he had understood at the time. He had been somewhere past the edge of his own body, the insulin emergency pulling him down into something dark and slow that he knew from experience was not a place you came back from if nobody found you in time. He had been alone in that booth. He had been going down fast, and a 68-year-old woman in an apron had gotten between him and the thing trying to kill him without asking who he was or what he belonged to or what it would cost her. He laid his head back against the stretcher and felt the glucose IV pulling him back toward himself, warm and steady. And he thought about what that meant. In the world Wade Steele had lived inside for 39 years, the debt created when someone put their body between you and harm was not a social nicety. It was not a debt you acknowledge with a phone call and a card. It was absolute. It ran deeper than money. It ran deeper than friendship. It was the kind of debt that changed the direction of what came next. He closed his eyes and made a decision. He made it the way Wade Steele made most decisions, not loudly, not with deliberation, but with the quiet finality of a man who had spent 4 decades learning the difference between the things that mattered and the things that did not. This mattered. Ruth Carver mattered. What she had done mattered. He pulled his phone from his vest and dialed Cole Decker's number. Cole picked up on the second ring. "I'm in an ambulance," Wade said before Cole could speak. A pause. "What happened?" "Blood sugar. I'm okay, but I need you to hear something." He watched Route 99 recede through the rear window. "There's a woman named Ruth Carver. She runs a diner 6 miles east on 99. I need you to know who she is." Cole listened without interrupting, the way a president listens when his VP is telling him something that is going to change the shape of what comes next. When Wade finished, there was a long silence on the line. "We'll be at the hospital when they bring you in," Cole said. "I know you will," Wade said. "But Cole..." "Yeah, when I'm out. We go to see her first, before anything else." Another silence. Then Cole Decker said, "Agreed." And the single word carried in it the full gravity of what it meant when the Iron Riders Bakersfield charter decided that someone had earned their full attention. Wade set his phone against his chest and let the ambulance carry him toward the hospital. Somewhere back along that road was a diner with a hand-lettered sign and a woman inside it who had knelt in front of him without knowing him, without asking what she was getting into, without hesitating for a single second. He owed her everything. And in the world the Iron Riders lived by, everything was exactly what she was going to receive. Wade was discharged from Bakersfield Memorial 3 days later on a Thursday morning, and the sight that greeted him at the hospital's sliding glass doors was exactly what he had expected and still managed to land in his chest with the warmth that 39 years of brotherhood produced without warning. 34 motorcycles lined the hospital drop-off in 2 orderly rows. The men who rode them leaning against the machines with the patient stillness of people who know how to wait. The cut on every back showed the same skull and wings, the California bottom rocker, the word Bakersfield below it. Cole Decker stood at the center of the formation. He was 55, compact with the kind of face that gave nothing away that its owner hadn't decided to give. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and he wore it the same way he wore everything without apology. He stepped forward and clasped Wade's forearm in the grip that meant more than a handshake. "Good to see you walking," Cole said. "Good to be walking," Wade said. The men came forward, one at a time, each with the same grip, the same brief eye contact that communicated what men like these rarely put in words. When it was done, Wade stood at the front of his column and looked at the faces of his brothers and felt the 39 years of it running through him. "I need to make a stop before we go back," he said. Cole nodded once. He already knew where. The formation of 34 motorcycles turned south on Route 99. The sound of them built ahead of their arrival, the way thunder builds before a storm, filling the long, flat road, reverberating off the irrigation infrastructure and the orchard windbreaks. Ruth Carver heard them before she saw them. She was behind the counter at 3 in the afternoon, the post-lunch quiet in the room, and the sound came in through the walls and the floor and the soles of her shoes as a low vibration that grew into a rumble, and grew from a rumble into something that shook the window glass in its frame. She stepped to the window. 34 motorcycles turned into her gravel lot in 2 columns, moving with the precision of a procession, each machine spacing itself from the one ahead with an exactness that spoke of long practice. They filled the lot completely and parked in a formation that left the entrance clear. The engines cut at intervals, the last one falling silent and leaving a ringing quiet that pressed against the ears. Danny appeared at her shoulder. His jaw was still swollen and discolored, yellowing at the edges of the bruise. He looked at the parking lot and then at his mother. "That's a lot of bikes," he said. "Yes, it is," Ruth agreed. The lead rider dismounted. Wade Steele walked toward the diner entrance with the deliberate unhurry of a man who has decided exactly what he is going to do. Ruth went to the door and opened it before he reached it. They looked at each other on the threshold, this enormous, road-worn man in his leather vest with the skull and wings, and the gray-haired woman in the white shirt and the burgundy apron, standing on the step of the diner she had held for 37 years. Behind him, 33 men sat on their motorcycles and watched without speaking. "Mrs. Carver," Wade said. His voice was low and careful in the way very large men are sometimes careful with their voices when they understand the weight of what they're carrying. "My name is Wade Steele. People call me Grizzly. I'm the vice president of the Iron Riders Bakersfield Charter." He paused. "I believe I owe you my life." Ruth looked at him steadily. "You owe me 2 glasses of orange juice and a lot of sugar," she said. "Come inside." Wade almost smiled. It changed his face entirely briefly, the way a light coming on in a dark room changes a space. He ducked his head slightly under the doorframe out of old habit and stepped in. Cole Decker followed. 2 other men followed Cole. The rest remained outside, patient as weather. Ruth poured coffee at the counter without being asked. She set cups in front of all 4 and poured for herself and leaned against the back counter and waited. "You knew what was happening to me," Wade said. "My husband was diabetic for 11 years, Ruth said. "Type 1. I knew the signs. Most people don't recognize it that fast. Most people don't spend 11 years married to it." She sipped her coffee. "You were at 31 when the paramedics read you. You had maybe 15 more minutes before the coma set in." Wade set his coffee down. "I know." A silence settled, not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that falls between 2 people who are communicating something that doesn't require words to travel. "Your son," Wade said, "how is he?" "Sore. Stubborn. Back in class this morning because I couldn't talk him out of it." Something crossed Ruth's face that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. "He gets that from his father." Cole had been listening without speaking in the way of a man who gathers before he speaks. Now he set his cup down. "Mrs. Carver, we're aware of what happened in this diner. We're aware of who those men were." Ruth said nothing. "We're aware," Cole continued, "that the police response was not what it should have been." "The police response was exactly what I expected it to be," Ruth said, once Grant Holloway was in the parking lot. Cole looked at her, then at Wade. Something passed between the 2 men. "You know who he is," Cole said. "I know he wants my diner," Ruth said. "I know his son was one of the 3 who came in here. And I know that whoever he called after the incident, the officers left without making any arrests." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I've been in this valley my whole life. I understand how that works." The quiet in the diner was absolute. Outside, the 32 men on the motorcycles sat in the afternoon sun, still and patient. "We'd like to help," Wade said. Ruth looked at him. Her expression was the expression of a woman who had navigated 68 years of people offering to help and had learned to read the specific grammar of each kind of offer. The kind that costs you something, the kind that costs the helper something, and the kind that is mostly about the helper feeling better about themselves. This felt different. This felt like something offered by people who had something real to give, and were giving it without arithmetic. "What would that look like in practical terms?" she said carefully. Cole said, "First, we'd like to know what you need." Ruth set her coffee down. Through the window, the sun was moving toward the western fields, the light going long and amber across the gravel and the parked motorcycles and the patient men. She thought about the letter from Holloway's lawyer that had arrived in her mailbox yesterday morning. She thought about Danny. She thought about 37 years. "Right now," she said, "I need someone to not let Grant Holloway take this place from me." She said it simply, without drama, with the directness of a woman who had stopped softening hard truths sometime in her 40s. "Everything else I can handle, but that I cannot handle alone." Wade Steele looked at her for a long moment. Then he placed both hands flat on the counter. "Mrs. Carver, you are not alone. Not anymore." Outside, the afternoon light fell across 34 motorcycles, and the men who had ridden them here, and the only sound was the wind coming off the fields and the faint creak of the diner sign swinging in the warm California air. The hand-lettered name with the slight wobble in the R where Earl had sneezed mid-stroke, and she had never asked him to redo it. The next morning, Ruth arrived at 4:53, same as always. She unlocked the diner, hit the lights in sequence, started the coffee. Pete arrived at 5:30, Danny at 6:15. The ritual held, and Ruth held it the way she held everything that mattered, with both hands and no drama. But something had changed in the room since yesterday, and she felt it in the way she felt changes in weather before anyone had named them. It was the letter. She had read it twice the night before, sitting at the kitchen table with the overhead light on and the television off the house, quiet around her, in the way houses go quiet when you are the only person in them. The letter was from a firm called Holloway and Associates, LLC, written in the particular language of lawyers who want you to feel the full weight of their clients' resources before you finish the first paragraph. It cited a county regulation she had never heard of regarding permits for diner operations within the Highway 99 corridor, suggesting her current operating license may not have been renewed under the correct classification. It cited a second regulation involving commercial kitchen ventilation compliance. It cited a third concerning parking lot drainage. Each citation was followed by a helpful note that failure to address these matters could result in temporary closure pending inspection. The letter was dated 2 days before Grant Holloway had walked into her diner and offered her $850,000. The timing was not subtle. Ruth had not expected it to be. She had not told Danny about the letter. She had folded it precisely along its original creases and placed it in the drawer beneath the register where she kept documents that required decisions. She had slept adequately. She had woken at 4 and lain in the dark and thought about Earl the way she thought about him when she needed to think clearly. Earl had always said that the best way to understand what someone was doing was to ask yourself what they were afraid of. Grant Holloway was not afraid of Ruth Carver specifically. He was afraid of the word no. He was afraid of a single woman in an apron standing between his plans and the ground those plans required. That was manageable. Fear was a predictable thing. Fear moved in straight lines. At 10 o'clock, a single motorcycle pulled into the lot. It was not 34 motorcycles. It was one, a black Harley with chrome that caught the morning sun like a mirror. The man who dismounted was one she recognized from the previous afternoon, one of the two who had come inside with Wade and Cole. His name, she would later learn, was Sawyer Flynn. He was 29, the youngest full member of the Bakersfield Charter, and he had the particular lanky patience of a young man who has been trusted with something and intends to demonstrate that the trust was warranted. He came in, ordered coffee, took the end stool at the counter, and opened a paperback. He did not speak to Ruth beyond the order. He did not look toward the parking lot or the door in any obvious way. He sat at the end stool with his coffee and his book, and he was simply present, the way a person is present in a room they intend to stay in. Ruth poured his coffee and looked at him for a moment. He met her eyes over the book. Something passed between them that was acknowledgement without ceremony. She returned to her work. He was still there at noon when the lunch rush built. He ordered a burger. He tipped generously. He read his book. At 1:15, a dark blue sedan pulled slowly into the parking lot, paused for an extended moment, and then pulled back out without stopping. Ruth had been watching. She did not see the driver's face. She saw the posture of a car that had intended to stop and changed its mind, and she was fairly certain she understood why. Sawyer Flynn closed his book, left his tip on the counter, and stood. "Same time tomorrow," he told her, not quite a question. "Coffee'll be hot," Ruth said. That evening, Ruth sat at the kitchen table with the Holloway letter in front of her again. She had a notepad beside it and a pen, and she was doing what Earl had always called her, accounting not of money, but of position, writing down what she knew and what she didn't know and what she needed to find out. What she knew, Grant Holloway wanted the land the diner sat on. He had sent the lawyer's letter before approaching her, which meant the offer had not been made in good faith. His son had been involved in the assault, and the police response had been shaped by a phone call Grant had made in the parking lot. The violations cited in the letter were almost certainly manufactured, the kind that required inside knowledge of regulatory language that a developer with county connections would have easy access to. What she needed to find out whether she had legal standing to fight the letter and what that fight would cost, and whether she had the resources to sustain it. She looked at the last item for a long time. Then she wrote beneath it, "Do not fight from a position of weakness. Understand the full shape of what you're in before you move." Earl had taught her that, not in those words, but in practice over decades of the particular education that a good marriage provides when both people are paying attention. She folded the letter and went to bed. 4 miles east, in the back corner booth of a roadside bar that had been a way station for the Bakersfield Charter for 12 years, Cole Decker sat across from Wade Steele and two other senior members, Hank Briggs and Tommy Roth. And they talked about Ruth Carver in the quiet, economical way of men making a plan. They talked for an hour. By the time Cole paid the tab and stood up, the shape of what came next was clear between them, even though very little of it had been said out loud. This was how the Iron Riders worked, not in announcements, but in understandings built from shared years and a code that didn't need to be recited because it had long since become the interior structure of each of them. The letter from Holloway's attorneys had arrived on a Monday. By Wednesday, a second letter arrived, this one from the Kern County Department of Environmental Health, informing Ruth Carver that a complaint had been filed regarding ventilation compliance in her commercial kitchen, and that a formal inspection was scheduled for the following Friday. The letter was formal and bureaucratic in the way of government correspondence, its language carefully neutral, its implications anything but. Ruth read it at the counter after the morning rush, standing very still, her coffee going cold beside her. Then she put it in the drawer with the first letter and called her accountant, a woman named Nadine Goss, who had handled their books for 14 years. Nadine confirmed what Ruth had already suspected. Their operating permits were current and properly classified. The ventilation system had been inspected and certified 18 months ago, well within the compliance window. The violations cited in both letters were either manufactured or were being weaponized from old records that had been resolved years prior. "This is manufactured pressure," Nadine told her. "Somebody is working through the regulatory system to create paperwork problems that have nothing to do with actual violations." "I know," Ruth said. "What does it take to fight it?" Nadine paused. "An attorney who knows regulatory law. That's not cheap, Ruth. Give me a number." Nadine gave her a number. Ruth wrote it down. She looked at it for a long moment. It was not catastrophic. It was also not manageable without either depleting the emergency reserve she had spent 4 years rebuilding after Earl's medical costs, or taking out a loan against the property, which, given that the property itself was the target of the pressure campaign, felt like precisely the wrong move. She thanked Nadine and hung up. She stood at the counter for a moment, looking at the room she had run for 37 years. The booths and the grill, and the faces of the people who trusted this place to be open when they needed it to be. Then she straightened her apron and picked up the coffee pot. Wade called that evening. She told him about the second letter, the inspection, and Nadine's number. "Don't hire the attorney yet," Wade said. "Give me 48 hours. "What happens in 48 hours? "I make some calls. We have a member named Garrett Locke. He did 15 years as a paralegal before he patched in. He knows regulatory law better than most attorneys who practice it. He's going to want to look at those letters." "I don't need charity, Wade." "Garrett doesn't do charity," Wade said. "He does work. And right now he's going to want to do this particular work. Don't ask me to explain the code to you, Mrs. Carver. Just give me 48 hours. Ruth gave him 48 hours. Garrett Locke arrived at the diner the next morning at 8. He was 46, lean, with reading glasses on a chain around his neck, and the careful organizational habits of a man who had spent 15 years managing documents that other people's fates depended on. He wore a plain flannel shirt. He sat at the counter with both letters and a cup of coffee and read with complete attention, making small marks in a notebook. He asked Ruth 4 questions. He drank his coffee. Then he told her that the citations in the first letter were applied from an outdated regulation superseded by a 2019 county revision, and that the ventilation code cited in the second letter did not apply to the specific equipment class her kitchen used. He said both of these things with the flat certainty of a man who has looked at a great many such documents and knows exactly what he is seeing. "This is a paper pressure campaign," he told her. "Whoever put this together knows the language well enough to make it look serious to a civilian. But they made 2 errors that tell me they pulled it off a template rather than doing original research on your specific permits. So I can fight it." "You can dissolve it," Garrett said, which was different and better. "I'll draft the responses. The county inspection flag will be dead before end of business next Tuesday. The attorney letters will get a response from me that makes very clear that whoever sent them did insufficient due diligence, which is either incompetence or dishonesty, and either way, they won't want it in writing." He paused. "They may try something else after this, but this particular avenue is closed." Ruth looked at him. "How much do I owe you?" Garrett put the letters in a folder. "My daughter's in college," he said. "If I bring her by this Saturday, can you make her a plate of French toast?" "I can make her whatever she wants," Ruth said. He left. Ruth stood behind the counter for a long moment after the door closed and felt something loosen in her chest that had been drawn tight since Monday. The specific tension of being alone with a problem you cannot see all the edges of. The weight was not gone, but it was different now. It was shared. The county inspector arrived Friday at 9:15. He was a young man of perhaps 30, earnest and slightly uncomfortable in the way of someone performing an assignment he did not entirely understand the context of. He worked through the kitchen with a clipboard and a checklist, and Ruth followed him through each item, answered each question directly, produced documentation when asked. He found one item he marked as requiring further review: a secondary duct fitting installed during a kitchen renovation 6 years ago. Ruth showed him the renovation permits. He photographed them and said he would need to flag the item for his supervisor. After he left, Pete looked at her from the kitchen. "That duct fitting is fine," he said. "I've been standing next to it for 6 years." "I know it is," Ruth said. "So what happens now?" "They close us temporarily while they investigate the flag," she said without inflection. "That's the strategy. It's not subtle, but it doesn't need to be." Pete was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You got any cavalry coming?" Ruth thought about Wade Steele and 34 motorcycles, and a man who had said, "You are not alone." "I might," she said. "I'm not sure what form it takes yet." The Thursday afternoon before the county's deadline for the inspection response, Danny came home from class with his jaw set in the tight way it went when he was angry and trying not to show it. He set his phone face up on the kitchen table between them. He had a 12-second video shot in the community college parking lot. It showed 3 young men, one identifiably Derek Holloway, walking away from Danny's truck, which now had a long key scratch running the entire length of the driver's side. Ruth looked at the video. Then she looked at her son. "Campus security said they couldn't identify them definitively from the angle," Danny said. "They filed a report." "Did they give you a report number?" "Yes." "Keep it." Ruth looked at the scratch. Earl's old truck. She had driven it for 3 years since he died, and it had never been perfect, but it had been whole. "Mom," Danny said, "these people are not going to stop." "I know. So what do we do?" Ruth looked at her son across the kitchen table. She thought about what Wade had said. Not alone. She thought about Garrett Locke and his reading glasses and his absolute certainty about outdated regulations. She thought about Sawyer Flynn reading his paperback at the end of the counter stool. "We hold," she said, "and we trust that the people who told us they were with us meant it." Danny looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once the way Earl used to nod when he had made a decision and was done second-guessing it. 2 days later, Danny was arrested. He was coming out of the community college library at 8 in the evening when 2 officers approached him in the parking lot. They informed him that a complaint had been filed against him by Grant Holloway, alleging that Daniel Carver had trespassed on the Holloway property on Oleander Avenue and damaged a vehicle in the driveway, a late-model Mercedes belonging to Grant Holloway's wife. The complaint cited damage occurring 3 days prior. Danny had not been to the Holloway property. He did not know where it was. He told the officers this clearly and without alarm, because in the moment of a calm person being falsely accused, calm is the best available armor. They listened with the patient attentiveness of people who had already decided what they were going to do. They put him in the back of a cruiser and drove him to the station. At 9:15, Ruth received a phone call from her son. She drove to the station. She sat in a hard plastic chair in the lobby for 3 hours while Danny was processed and held pending arraignment. And she did not allow herself to feel the full weight of what this was, because if she felt the full weight of it, she would not be functional, and she needed to be functional. She sat straight in the plastic chair with her purse on her lap and breathed steadily. She called Wade Steele from the parking lot at midnight. He picked up immediately. She told him in 3 sentences what had happened. There was a silence on the line, and the sound of voices around him went quiet. When he spoke, his voice was low and deliberate. "They took your son." "Yes." "On a manufactured complaint." "Yes." Another silence. Then, "I'm sending someone to the station right now. His name is Kevin Hogan. He's a licensed bondsman, and he's going to get Danny out tonight." A pause. "And Mrs. Carver." After that, we're done playing defense. Ruth sat in the parking lot in Earl's truck and looked at the building where her son was being held and felt the particular tightening in her chest crystallize into something sharper and clearer. Not anger exactly, but anger's more purposeful cousin. The thing that comes after you have been patient long enough, and the people across from you have mistaken your patience for weakness. "Good," she said. Kevin Hogan arrived at the station in 40 minutes and had Danny out by 2 in the morning. Danny walked out into the cold night air and got into his mother's truck, and Ruth put the truck in gear and drove home without speaking, because there were things that didn't need to be said, and this was one of them. At the kitchen table with the overhead light on and the house quiet, Ruth made her list. What she knew, what she didn't know, what she needed to find out. She looked at the list for a long time. Then she wrote at the bottom, "Trust the people who are with you." She went to bed. 5 miles north at the Iron Riders Bakersfield Charter House, Cole Decker stood at the head of the long table and looked at the 14 senior members assembled there. Wade was at his right. Garrett Locke had his folder open. "They arrested her son on a false complaint," Cole said. "He said it the way you read an invoice, precisely as a statement of what is owed. They've manufactured regulatory violations against her diner. They've tried to intimidate her through the court system. Now they've moved against her family." The room was quiet. "I want to understand the full shape of what Holloway is," Cole said. "I want to know how deep the police connection runs. I want to know what he's built his operation on and what happens if the foundation shifts." He looked at Garrett. "Start from the beginning." Garrett opened his folder. He had been doing the work for 4 days, methodical, patient, document-heavy work that paralegal training produces when applied to a motivated man with a network. The picture that emerged over the next 90 minutes was not surprising in its architecture, but was extensive in its detail. Grant Holloway had been operating in the Kern County development space for 18 years. He had built a substantial portfolio of commercial properties and residential developments, most of them legitimate on the surface. But threaded through the legitimate operation was a secondary structure, a set of limited liability companies whose ownership was obscured through layers of registered agents and nominee directors companies that had received city contract payments for infrastructure work that was either never performed or performed at a fraction of the billed amount. Garrett had found 3 specific projects. He had found documentation of the contracts and the payments in the absence of corresponding work product. He had a source inside the county assessor's office who had provided copies of the relevant records. The copies were in the folder. The police connection was simpler and uglier. Wayne Briggs had been the Bakersfield PD chief of detectives for 9 years. He and Grant Holloway had been in the same college fraternity at Cal State Bakersfield, a fact that would have been unremarkable, except that it was accompanied by a pattern of financial transfers between an LLC controlled by Holloway and a real estate trust controlled by Briggs's wife. Transfers that had occurred on a quarterly basis for 7 years, in total just under $300,000. The source for this had been a member of the club who worked as an electrician contractor in the city utilities building and had been on a job in the records archive when he recognized the names and understood what he was looking at. Cole looked at the folder. "This is enough," he said. "It's more than enough," Garrett said. "The LLC transfers alone are a federal matter if they're what they appear to be. The contract fraud is a state matter. Together, if this gets in front of the right people, Grant Holloway is not going to be in a position to threaten anyone's diner for a very long time." "What's the right move?" Wade said. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We go to Holloway himself first. A man should know what's coming before it arrives, if he has any dignity left. We show him what we have, and we tell him exactly what is going to happen to him, and to the detective who has been cashing his checks. And we tell him that the only thing standing between him and federal investigators is whether he makes Ruth Carver whole before Monday morning." The room was quiet. "And after Holloway," Hank said. Cole looked at him. "Ruth Carver mentioned that her husband had a friend at the local paper, a reporter. She mentioned it in passing, the way people mention things they haven't yet thought of as useful." He paused. "I want to know who that reporter is. When we have the name, that reporter gets a copy of everything in that folder, whether Holloway cooperates or not. Either way, those documents don't stay private." He looked around the table at each face in turn. "Ruth Carver kept a dying man from the floor with 2 glasses of orange juice and a lot of sugar, and she did it without asking what it would cost her. We are going to make sure that the people who decided she was a soft target understand permanently that they were wrong." The morning of the Holloway meeting, Roy Pendleton arrived at the diner at 7. He came in and sat at the counter and ordered coffee and said his name, and Ruth told him she already knew who he was. He had the journalist's face, the face of someone who has spent decades listening to people tell him things that turned out to be only partly true, and who has learned to hear the half that's missing. He also had behind that the face of a man who had sat beside Earl Carver on a riverbank every 3rd Saturday for 16 years, and knew what a person who mattered to Earl Carver looked like. "I got a call last night," Roy said, "and a folder. I wanted to hear it from you first, before I do anything with what they sent me." Ruth put her coffee pot down. She leaned against the back counter and told him all of it. She told him about the morning Grant Holloway had walked in and surveyed the diner like a contractor reviewing demolition plans. She told him about Wade's medical crisis and what she had done. She told him about the letters and the inspection and Danny's arrest. She told it clearly and in sequence, without drama or inflation, the way she would tell anything true precisely, without omission, with the particular authority of someone who was there. Roy listened with the full, forward attention of a man who understood that the most important thing a journalist could do was be quiet long enough to hear what was actually being said. He asked 4 questions. When she finished, he wrapped both hands around his mug. "Earl talked about this diner every time I saw him," Roy said. "Every time. He'd say the coffee is right, the biscuits are right, and the woman who runs it knows how to hold the thing together." He paused. He was right about all 3. Ruth said nothing. "I'm going to verify what they sent me through my own sources," Roy said. "That will take 3 or 4 days. If what I'm reading holds up, and I think it does, this is a front-page story." He looked at her. "You'll be in it. I'll keep your exposure to a minimum, but you'll be in it." "I understand," Ruth said. "It's also going to make things uncomfortable for people in this county who have been comfortable for a long time," Roy said. "Some of that discomfort may find its way back toward you." Ruth looked at him. "Roy," she said, "a man in a leather vest and 33 of his brothers told me I am not alone. I believe them. Roy looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee and drank and set it down. I'll call you when the story runs, he said. Coffee's always on, she told him. He left a $10 bill on the counter for a $3 coffee and walked out into the morning. Ruth watched his car pull out of the lot. She turned back to the counter and picked up the coffee pot. Wade called at 9. We're meeting with Holloway this morning, he said, 10 o'clock, at his office. Ruth said, I want to be there. A silence. Mrs. Carver, he's coming after my family in my town, she said. I want to be there when he understands that it didn't work. A longer silence. Then Wade said, we'll pick you up at 9:30. She hung up. She told Pete she'd be out until noon. She went into the back and changed into the clean blouse she kept on a hook in the office. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the office sink. A 68-year-old woman with gray hair cut short and a face that showed its years honestly, not with apology, but with the clarity that comes from having earned every one of them. She thought about Earl. He would say go. He would say, you've always known how to walk into a room. She smoothed the front of her blouse and went back to the counter. The formation that arrived at 9:30 was smaller than the one that had filled her parking lot. 6 motorcycles. Cole Decker in front, Wade beside him, Garrett Locke and 3 others behind them. They pulled in quiet and neat, and Cole walked to the diner entrance and held the door. Ruth stepped out with her purse and her composure and got into the passenger side of a black truck that Tommy Roth had pulled around behind the bikes, and the formation turned north toward the city. Grant Holloway's office occupied the 14th floor of a commercial building in downtown Bakersfield. The lobby had the over-designed quality of a space that wants to communicate wealth through materials, marble floors, a reception desk the size of a small aircraft carrier, recessed lighting that cost more per hour than Ruth's refrigeration unit. The receptionist looked at the group that walked in from the elevator with the involuntary alarm of someone who has been trained to screen for exactly this kind of interruption and is now realizing the training may not be sufficient. Cole gave his name. He said they were here to see Grant Holloway regarding a business matter of immediate urgency. He said it with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being taken seriously in rooms that do not initially plan to take him seriously. The receptionist made a phone call. Then she told them Mr. Holloway would be with them shortly. He made them wait 11 minutes. Ruth sat in the waiting area and looked at the valley view from the 14th floor. The flat, enormous spread of it, the fields and roads and infrastructure that her family had lived beside her entire life, and felt no particular urgency. She had waited in harder places than this. Grant Holloway appeared at the conference room door with the controlled expression of a man who has been warned something uncomfortable is happening and has arranged his face accordingly. He had a young attorney with him whose posture communicated that she was here to note everything and say little. The conference room was large and glass-walled, with a long table running its length. Cole sat at one side, Wade beside him, Garrett Locke with his folder. Ruth sat between Cole and Wade. Grant Holloway looked at Ruth. Something moved behind his eyes. Reassessment, recalculation, and then it went away behind the smooth surface he maintained for business. Mrs. Carver, he said, I wasn't expecting you. I'm aware of that, Ruth said. They sat. Holloway's attorney opened a leather portfolio. Garrett Locke opened his folder. Cole said, Mr. Holloway, we're going to show you something and then we're going to tell you what we want. The conversation doesn't have to be long. Holloway folded his hands on the table with the patience of a man who is planning to end this quickly. Is that so? Garrett slid a stapled document set across the table. Holloway looked at it. His attorney leaned in. A silence passed, precise and clinical. The silence of people reading something they were not expecting to read. Ruth watched Grant Holloway's face with the careful attention she had always brought to faces, and watched the color in it do something that expensive suits and corporate patience cannot prevent it left. It left in stages the way confidence leaves a room when the floor opens under it. The attorney said very quietly, Grant. Just his name. A warning in a single syllable. Holloway looked up from the document. He looked at Cole. He looked at Wade. He looked at Ruth. His face had rearranged itself into something that was trying to hold the shape of authority, but was losing the structural integrity for it. "Where did you get this?" he said. "That's not the relevant question," Cole said. "The relevant question is what happens next. We're going to tell you, and then you're going to decide." He leaned forward slightly. "The charges against Ruth Carver's son are dropped this afternoon. The county inspection flag on her diner is cleared by end of business Wednesday. You do not communicate with her, her employees, her property, or her son again, by any means, directly or through an intermediary. Your relationship with Chief Detective Briggs is ended, and you make no attempt to contact him regarding this meeting or any related matter." Holloway said nothing. "In return," Cole continued, "what's in that folder stays in this room. For now." He paused. "If I hear even a whisper of pressure against that woman, these files go directly to the FBI field office and the local press simultaneously. You will lose everything. Is that clear?" The attorney leaned close to Holloway and said something very low. Holloway listened without expression. Then he looked across the table at Ruth. "And if I don't agree," he said, "then everything in that folder is on the desks of the FBI field office and the Bakersfield Californian before the end of the business day," Cole said. "We've already identified who we're sending it to at both addresses." The room held this for a long moment. Outside the 14th floor window, the valley stretched flat and enormous and indifferent to all of it. Ruth looked at Grant Holloway across the table. He was looking at the document in front of him, not at her. He was looking at the shape of what he had built and what it cost to hold it up and what it would cost now to hold it differently. She had spent 68 years watching men make this calculation. She knew exactly what it looked like. "The charges against my son," she said. Her voice was steady and clear, and not unkind, because she was 68 years old, and she had nothing left to prove and nothing to be cruel about. "Today." Holloway looked at her. "And the diner," she said. "You leave it alone. You leave us alone. Whatever you were planning to build on that land, you find different land." She held his eyes. "My husband built that counter with his own hands. The sign above the door has a wobble in the R because he sneezed mid-stroke, and I never asked him to redo it. That diner is not real estate. It is not inventory. It is the place where a community of real people have been eating breakfast together for 37 years, and you are not going to take it from them because you want to put a strip mall there." The room was very quiet. Grant Holloway was quiet for a long time. Then, without looking up from the table, he said to his attorney, "Call the DA's office." She was already dialing. The charges against Danny Carver were dropped at 3:47 that afternoon. The county inspection flag was cleared the following Wednesday, as agreed. Grant Holloway's lawyers sent no further letters. The pressure campaign stopped the way a machine stops when someone pulls the power completely without a gradual diminishment all at once. Roy Pendleton spent 4 days verifying the documents through his own sources, which was fast for a story of this magnitude because he had been covering Kern County development for 28 years and knew exactly who to call and what questions to ask. The story ran on a Friday morning in the Bakersfield Californian's lead position, with a subhead in the business section and a second piece on the local government corruption angle. By Friday afternoon, the FBI field office in Fresno had confirmed it was reviewing the materials. Wayne Briggs placed himself on administrative leave that evening. Grant Holloway's attorney issued a statement. Holloway himself said nothing. Ruth read the story at the counter on Friday morning, before the breakfast rush with her coffee going warm beside her. Roy had written it the way good reporters write about people they respect, without sentimentality, without softening the facts, but with the particular human precision that distinguishes a story from a filing. Ruth's name appeared only as a local business owner whose property Holloway had sought to acquire, which was what Roy had told her he would do when he called Thursday to give her notice the piece was running. She had thanked him. He had said something about Earl that she could not repeat without her voice changing, and she had put the phone down after and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand on the pass-through counter and breathed. Danny came in at 6:15. He looked at the newspaper on the counter and read the headline. He looked at his mother. "You knew this was coming," he said. "I knew something was coming," she said. "I trusted the people who were working on it." He looked at the paper again. He looked at her. "Mom," he said, and the single word carried in it everything he was not going to put into more words. The whole of what he had just understood about her. "Coffee's hot," she told him. "Table 6 needs silverware." He stood there for another moment, looking at her with the expression of a young man revising upward his understanding of what his mother is made of. Then he got the silverware. The week that followed had a particular texture that Ruth recognized from other moments in her life, when a thing that had been holding itself upright against pressure finally let go. The quiet was different afterward. Not peaceful exactly, more spacious, like a room after a window has been opened. The diner continued its rhythms. Charlie Moss set his fork down on Thursday morning and said, "Saw the piece in the paper, glad it worked out." Then he went back to his eggs. Ruth understood that this was from Charlie Moss, a significant communication. Doris Flagg came in and set a pot of honey from her sister's farm on the counter and told Ruth she intended to bring her ladies' book club here for lunch every other Wednesday from now on. Ruth said she'd look forward to it. The word moved along Route 99 the way word moves along any corridor served by the same drivers every day, through the informal transmission of people who share roads and know which stops are worth knowing about. By the end of the week, the lunch rush was larger than it had been in 2 years. On Thursday afternoon, Wade came in at his usual time. He sat at the counter and Ruth poured his coffee. "The FBI confirmed they opened a formal review this morning," he said. "Roy's source at the courthouse." "I know," Ruth said. "Roy called me." Wade nodded. "Holloway's attorney has filed for a delay on all pending county projects pending the review. His company is essentially frozen." "I know that too." A silence. Then Wade said, "How are you?" Ruth looked at him. It was a real question, the kind that doesn't ask for a report, but for the actual answer. She thought about it honestly. "Tired," she said. "The way you're tired when something that required everything finally stops requiring everything." She paused. "And grateful, in a way that I'm still trying to find the right words for." Wade nodded. He drank his coffee. The afternoon sun came through the window at the angle that caught the pass-through counter warm and familiar, and exactly the same as it had been every afternoon for 37 years. "Cole wants to know," Wade said, "if it would be all right to bring the brothers by. Not an occasion, just to eat. Saturday morning." Ruth looked at him. "How many brothers?" 34. She considered the 14 booths and 8 counter stools, and the logistics of feeding 34 large men in leather vests on a Saturday morning. She thought about Pete, who would grunt his way through it with the magnificent stoicism of a man who had worked every conceivable service situation and was not going to be undone by volume. "Tell Cole to come hungry," she said. Saturday morning arrived with the particular quality of California autumn mornings that do not commit to cold a crisp edge in the air, the first real suggestion that the season was considering a change. But the sky, the flat, optimistic blue that the valley does better than anywhere. Ruth was behind the counter at 5:15 when she hit the lights in sequence. She had warned Pete Thursday evening. He had grunted in a way she interpreted as acceptance mixed with mild professional concern about inventory. She had doubled the weekend order, and he had grunted again, more favorably. Danny came in at 6 and Ruth told him. He stood at the pass-through with his coffee and did the arithmetic the way young men who study business administration do arithmetic automatically and visibly. "We can do 30 if we move the chess guy's corner table next to booth 12 and extend the counter setup." "I know," Ruth said. "I already moved the table." He looked past her and saw that she had. "Right," he said. "I'll need more syrup bottles." Second shelf in back. He was already headed there. The first sound of them came at 7:45, the low vibration through the floor that Ruth had come to recognize as the specific frequency of many motorcycles moving in formation, building from a suggestion to a certainty over about a minute before the first headlights appeared at the far end of the access road. She stood at the window and watched them come, 34 motorcycles in 2 columns, the morning light catching the chrome, the exhaust visible in the cool air, the sound filling the valley and rolling out across the empty fields in every direction. They filled the parking lot. The engines cut at intervals, each one falling away in succession. And then the silence was enormous and complete, and the morning birds started up again, almost immediately, as though reassured. Cole Decker came in first. He held the door for Wade, who ducked his head at the frame, out of old habit. The others filed in behind them in a movement that was organized without being formal, the men distributing themselves across the available seating with the practical efficiency of people who have been in difficult spaces together for many years. The booths filled, the counter stools filled, the extended corner table filled. 3 men pulled chairs from the wall and arranged them at the end of the counter with the self-sufficient ease of people who are comfortable wherever they find themselves. Ruth stood at the counter and looked at the room she had been running for 37 years now, filled from wall to wall with men in black leather and denim. The room smelled of coffee in the outdoors and the warm metal smell of motorcycles, and it was louder than it had been in years, but with the specific vitality of a full room where people are comfortable, where conversation is happening at multiple tables simultaneously, where the ordinary human pleasure of being in company and about to eat is operating at full capacity. She felt something in her chest expand. "Coffee all around," she called. A consensus of affirmatives from 34 men. She poured. Danny worked the room with her, and for the first time in a long time, Ruth watched her son at work without the underlying current of worry she had been carrying for weeks. He was easy in the room, comfortable with these men in the way young people are comfortable with people whose directness leaves no room for social performance. He took orders and filled cups and brought plates with the slightly too loud confidence that Ruth had always loved in him. The confidence of a young man becoming himself, learning what he was made of by finding out what the room required. Pete sent the first plates out at 8:15. Eggs and bacon and hash browns and biscuits and the French toast that Sawyer Flynn had mentioned to 11 of his brothers, each of whom had ordered it. Pete's biscuits were the particular kind that required no ambition from the eater and no apology from the cook. Plain and hot and exactly sufficient. The plates moved through the room and were received with the attentiveness of hungry people who are actually tasting what they are eating. Wade was at the counter. He ate his eggs and his biscuit and drank his coffee and looked at the room with the expression of a man who is satisfied in the larger structural way, a man who understands that a debt has been paid and paid well. Ruth refilled his coffee. He looked at her. "How's the back of your head?" he asked. "It's been 3 weeks, Wade." "I know. How is it?" "Fine. It was a contusion, not a fracture. I have a thick skull, which Earl always said was my most useful trait." He wasn't wrong. Ruth leaned against the back counter. The room was full and warm, and the morning was doing what Saturday mornings in the diner did, opening out into the long, unhurried quality of a day that has no urgency. She looked at the wall behind the counter, where she kept the things she had kept for 37 years. The calendar from the Bakersfield Feed and Supply, 4 years outdated, but kept because Earl had drawn a small star on the date of their anniversary. The framed photograph of the diner from 1988, the year they expanded the kitchen. The single shelf of ceramic salt and pepper shakers shaped like different California animals that customers had brought her over the decades, an accumulation that had become as native to the wall as the paint itself. And the photograph of Earl. This one was from the year they'd opened Earl, behind the counter, in a white apron, one hand flat on the surface he had just installed, looking directly at the camera with the expression of a man who has just built something and knows it and cannot entirely contain his own satisfaction. His eyes were the eyes Ruth had fallen in love with at 22. The eyes that said, "I am paying attention to this, all of it. I am not going to miss it." She looked at the photograph. She thought about what Earl would say looking at this room right now. She thought he would be entirely quiet about it, the way Earl was quiet about the things that moved him the most. And he would put his hand on her shoulder, and he would nod once slowly in the way that meant everything. The morning moved through itself. More coffee, more biscuits, Pete's hash browns, which were the crispy kind that required no additional intervention. The conversation in the room built and layered and had the comfortable, unstructured quality of people who are at ease with each other, and Ruth moved through it in her circuit and let the morning hold her the way it always held her, in the reliable structure of work she had been doing long enough that it was no longer effort, but extension, a continuation of herself into the room. At 9:30, Cole finished his breakfast and set his fork down and looked at Ruth. "We want to do something," he said, "if you'll let us." Ruth looked at him. "What kind of something?" "The kind that's a gift," he said, "not an obligation. You can say no." She waited. "The parking lot," Cole said. "The drainage on the east side has been problematic. I can see the erosion along the fence line and the gravel settling wrong. We have two brothers who run a small paving and grading company. They want to come out next week and fix it properly with a drainage solution that doesn't wash out every wet season." He paused. "Also, the ventilation unit on the north side of the kitchen is running older than it should. We'd like to replace it." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. "The drainage has been a problem for 12 years, she said. "I know," Cole said. "Sawyer mentioned it when he was doing the perimeter check." Ruth looked at the room. At Sawyer at the end of the counter with his coffee and a paperback. At Wade beside her quietly attentive. At the 32 other men distributed through the booths and tables of this room she had been running for 37 years, eating the food Pete had cooked, drinking the coffee she had poured. "The drainage, yes," she said, "but I'll pay for the ventilation unit myself. I've been meaning to replace it for 2 years. I'll do it properly." Cole nodded. "Fair." "And Cole," she looked at him directly, "tell your brothers they're welcome here. Any morning, any of them. Coffee's on me permanently and they can pay for the food, because Pete would be genuinely offended if they didn't." Cole almost smiled, which on his face was a significant event. "Agreed." At 10:15, Danny was clearing the corner table when he stopped and held up a hand to catch Ruth's attention. He pointed to where Sawyer had been sitting at the end stool. Sawyer was gone. In his place where the tip would normally be was a folded piece of paper. Ruth picked it up. It was the first page of what appeared to be a rental comparison analysis, with 3 names and numbers and brief descriptions. At the top in Sawyer's handwriting, 3 words for your consideration. She looked at Danny. "These are motorcycle repair shops," he said slowly, "in Bakersfield. These are their rent situations." He paused. "He knows you've been thinking about expanding the mechanical side. We talked about it 2 weeks ago, remember? When you were thinking about the back lot." Ruth remembered. She had said in passing that if the east lot had proper drainage, she had always thought there was room for a small automotive service bay, in addition to the diner that would serve the truckers who needed minor repairs on the Route 99 corridor. She had said it in passing. She had not thought anyone had been paying close enough attention to carry it forward. She folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket. The breakfast wound down through the mid-morning. Men settled their tabs with Danny, each one generous in the way of people who understand the value of what they are paying for. They filed out in the order they'd come in, and the parking lot filled back up with the sound of engines starting, each one finding its note, the formation assembling with the same disciplined precision as the arrival. Ruth stood at the window. Cole Decker was the last one. He put on his helmet and then looked back at the diner door, at Ruth standing in the window. He raised one hand, not a wave exactly, but something more specific. An acknowledgement, a recognition, the kind that passes between two people who understand each other's accounting without needing to go through the numbers. Ruth raised her hand in return. The formation turned south on Route 99. The sound of them built and then diminished and then was gone, absorbed into the wide, flat morning, and the parking lot was empty again, and the birds were back, and the fields stretched in every direction under the open California sky. Ruth stood at the window for a moment longer. Then she turned around. The diner was empty and quiet, the tables needing to be cleared and reset for the afternoon. Pete was cleaning the grill with the methodical satisfaction of a job finished well. Danny was at the counter counting the morning's register with the business student precision that had always made Ruth quietly proud. She went to the photograph on the wall. Earl in his white apron, his hand flat on the counter he had built, looking directly at the camera with those eyes that said, "I am paying attention, all of it. I am not going to miss it." "Well," Ruth said to the photograph. Her voice was quiet, not dramatic, the voice of a woman having a private conversation with a person she misses every morning and every evening and most of the hours in between. "We made it through that one." She looked at the room around her, at the tables that needed clearing, at Danny at the register, at Pete behind the kitchen window, at the 14 booths and 8 stools and 3 ceiling fans, and the ceramic salt and pepper shakers lined up on the shelf. 37 years, she said to the photograph, still standing. She picked up her coffee cup and moved into the afternoon. In the weeks that followed, the story Roy Pendleton had written was picked up by the Associated Press and ran in 17 California papers. The FBI investigation into Grant Holloway's shell companies was confirmed as active by the regional office. Wayne Briggs resigned from the Bakersfield PD, pending the outcome of the investigation into the financial relationship between his family trust and Holloway's LLC. Derek Holloway and his friends Kyle Rourke and Bryce Lund were identified in Ruth's original police report, which was reopened following the publication of Roy's piece. And each was subsequently charged with misdemeanor assault charges that carried real consequences, not the nothing that Grant's phone call had originally purchased. The drainage in the east parking lot was repaired on a Tuesday in November by 2 members of the Iron Riders, who arrived at 7 in the morning and worked until 4 with the focused professionalism of men doing work they are genuinely good at. Ruth brought them lunch and coffee and stayed out of their way, and by 4 the lot had a proper grade and a drainage channel that would handle the wet season and the 5 or 10 years of wet seasons after it. The ventilation unit Ruth replaced herself in December, hiring a company out of Fresno that Nadine had recommended. She paid for it from the operating account, which took a dent, and was immediately replenished over the following 6 weeks by the lunch business that Doors Flags Book Club and 2 other regular group accounts had added to the weekly average. The diner's numbers, which had been running tight for 2 years, began to breathe differently. Sawyer Flynn's rental comparison sheet stayed in Ruth's apron pocket for most of November before she took it out one evening at the kitchen table and read it properly. She thought about it for a week. Then she called Danny in and set it on the table between them, and they talked for 2 hours about the back lot and the service bay Earl had imagined, and the specific corridor of Route 99 truckers who needed exactly what a small automotive service operation could provide. Danny had taken a business planning course and had opinions about the numbers. Ruth had 37 years of knowing this road and its traffic and its needs, and had opinions about everything else. By Christmas, they had a plan. It was the size of a first step, which is the only size a plan needs to be when you are beginning something you intend to do well. Danny had found a used hydraulic lift being sold by a garage in Fresno that was closing. He drove up on a Saturday and came back with it in a rented trailer, grinning the way he grinned when something had worked out with the whole face involved, undisguised and unapologetic. And Ruth watched him back the trailer into the lot and thought about Earl, who had grinned exactly that way. She thought, there he is. The service bay opened in March on a Saturday that started cold and warmed into the comfortable mid-70s that passed for winter's end in the valley. Danny had spent 6 weeks building it out with a methodical thoroughness that surprised even Ruth. He had sourced the equipment with the careful research of a young man who cannot afford to make mistakes and knows it. He had obtained the business license and the insurance and the liability permits with the organizational precision of a student who had spent 2 years learning exactly this kind of process and was finally deploying it on something real. The sign above the bay was simple. Danny had painted it himself, which was a decision that ran in the family. It read, Carver Auto, and Danny's R had a slight wobble in it too, not from a sneeze, but from the particular unsteady hand of someone who is painting letters for the first time and trying too hard to hold the brush perfectly, which always produces something perfectly imperfect. Ruth had not asked him to redo it. She had looked at it for a long moment, and when she turned away, her eyes were bright, and Danny had not understood why, but he would someday. The first car that came in was Wade's daughter Keely's Honda, the clutch job Cole had mentioned. Danny took 2.5 hours and charged a fair rate, and the clutch was right when she drove it out. She was 26 and had Wade's dark eyes and the specific directness of a woman who has grown up around people who say what they mean. She shook Danny's hand and paid without negotiating and said she'd be back for the oil change in April. The second car was Charlie Moss's produce truck, which had been needing new brake pads since December. Charlie brought it in on a Wednesday morning, ate his eggs at the counter while Danny worked, and tipped $3 on a $12 breakfast, which was outside his known parameters, and which Ruth noted without comment. The word moved along Route 99 the way word always moved along that road. By April, the service bay had a consistent weekly schedule. By May, Danny had hired a part-time assistant, a young man from the community college studying automotive technology who needed the hours. Ruth watched her son manage another person for the first time and thought about the particular pleasure of watching someone become capable of a thing you couldn't have prepared them for directly, that they had to find their way to themselves. In April, the FBI investigation reached its formal stage. Roy called Ruth to give her notice before the follow-up story ran. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing related to the investigation at all. About the river, in a particular stretch below the reservoir, where Earl had always caught nothing, but had always gone anyway. And Ruth found herself laughing at something Roy said about Earl and his fishing hat and the specific stubbornness of a man who refused to admit the fish weren't there. It was the first time she had laughed about Earl, not at a memory that hurt before it was funny, but one that was just funny, cleanly and simply, without the grief underneath it. She noticed this. She did not make too much of it, but she noticed it the way she noticed small changes in the diner's patterns, with the particular attentiveness of a woman who has learned to read the temperature of the room. Wayne Briggs was subsequently indicted in May on 2 counts of federal bribery and 1 count of obstruction. Derek Holloway accepted a plea deal on the misdemeanor assault charges in March, which included community service and a formal letter of apology. The letter arrived at the diner by certified mail. It was short and legally drafted and said very little of its own volition. But it existed, and its existence was the important thing. The formal record that the thing had happened, and the people it happened to had been heard. Ruth read the letter once, then put it in the drawer. Sawyer Flynn still came in most mornings. He no longer came in the specific context of a protective detail, but the coffee was genuinely good, and the biscuits were what biscuits should be. And a man who finds a counter stool he likes tends to keep coming back to it. He read his way through a remarkable number of paperbacks over the spring and summer. Ruth never asked what he was reading, but occasionally, when she refilled his cup, he would hold the book up toward her cover out briefly, the way people do when they want to share something without making a production of it. She began to look forward to this small exchange. Wade came in on Tuesdays, usually sometimes Thursdays. He ate his eggs and drank his coffee, and occasionally said something useful, and occasionally said nothing at all, and both were equally comfortable. He had stopped wincing when he sat down, which was the indicator Ruth had been watching since November. His color was better. He was checking his blood sugar with the consistency of a man who has received a significant reminder of what happens when he doesn't. Ruth did not mention this directly, but occasionally, without comment, set a glass of orange juice beside his coffee. He never refused it. Cole came in once a month consistently and ate what was put in front of him without complaint, which was the highest compliment a man like Cole Decker offered in a setting like this. He still looked at the room with the assessing quiet of a president reading a situation, but now what he read in it was something different from what had brought him here the previous fall. Not a problem requiring management, but a place he had come to regard as worth being in. On a Tuesday evening in October, Ruth was closing down the diner when headlights swept across the wall and a single motorcycle pulled into the gravel lot. She knew the sound of it. Wade came in the front door, ducking his head at the frame, and sat at his usual stool. He was later than he usually came, and he wasn't wearing his leather vest, just a flannel shirt and his jeans and his boots, which meant this was not a club visit, just a man stopping at a counter where he was comfortable. Ruth poured his coffee without being asked. He wrapped his hands around the mug and looked at the counter for a moment, then up at the photograph on the wall. At Earl in his white apron, hand flat on the counter, eyes paying full attention. "Good man," he asked. "The best I've known," Ruth said. Wade nodded once, slowly. He drank his coffee. The diner was quiet around them, the kitchen clean, the tables reset, the room holding the warmth that a building carries at the end of a day of sustained use. "My wife left a long time ago," Wade said. He said it simply as a fact without inflection. 15 years. I don't blame her. The life is what it is. He turned the mug in his hands. "I have a daughter. You know her, Keely. She has my eyes and her mother's sense." He paused. "She's good." "She is," Ruth said. Danny said she knew exactly what the car was doing before he looked at it. Almost a smile. "She grew up around engines." He was quiet for a moment. "What I'm trying to say," he stopped, tried again. "This place, sitting at this counter, it matters to me. I wanted you to know that." Ruth looked at him. At this enormous, road-worn man sitting at her counter in the quiet of a Tuesday evening, turning a coffee mug in his calloused hands and saying the thing that was hardest to say. "You know," she said, "when I found you in that booth, I wasn't thinking about what would happen after. I was thinking about Earl, about the 11 years of watching for the signs, about knowing what to do." She paused. "I didn't do it for a reward or a debt or anything that had a word attached to it. I did it because it was in front of me and I had the knowledge to do it." She looked at the photograph. "Earl always said the things you can do are the things you're responsible for doing. That's not a burden. That's just clarity." Wade looked at her. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a good way to live." "It's the only way I know how," she said. He finished his coffee. He reached into his shirt pocket and set something on the counter between them. A small round coin, bronze-colored with the Iron Rider's emblem on it. "It's a challenge coin," Wade said. "It means you're under the protection of the club. Anywhere you show it," he looked at her. "You've had that protection for a year now. Cole wanted you to have the coin so you know it formally." Ruth looked at the coin. Then she picked it up. It was heavier than she'd expected, solid and worn at the edges, in the way of something that has been in pockets and passed between hands for a long time. She turned it over in her palm. Then she walked to the shelf where the ceramic salt and pepper shakers lived, the California animals, the accumulated tokens of 37 years of customers who had brought her small pieces of the world outside the diner's walls. She found a clear space near the photograph of Earl and set the coin there where the evening light caught it. She returned to the counter. "Tell Cole thank you," she said. "Tell him yourself," Wade said. "He'll be in Saturday." "I know," Ruth said, "but tell him anyway." Wade stood. He put on his jacket. At the door he paused in the way he had never stopped pausing, the hesitation of a large man in a world built for smaller ones. He looked at the room one more time, the tables reset for tomorrow, the ceiling fans still, the coin on the shelf catching a last gleam. "Same time next Thursday," he said. "Coffee'll be hot," Ruth told him. He went out. The motorcycle started. She heard it move south on Route 99, the sound diminishing and then gone, absorbed into the October night, the valley receiving it the way the valley received everything. Ruth turned off the last lights. She picked up her purse and her keys. At the door, she turned back and looked at the diner, in the dark, the familiar shapes of the booths and the counter, The faint glow of the closed sign in the window, the ceramic animals on the shelf, the coin among them catching a last gleam from the parking lot light. The photograph of Earl. She said, as she said every evening, not aloud, but in the language that had grown between her and the man in the photograph, over 41 years of marriage and 3 years of his absence. See you in the morning. She locked the door. Outside, the October air was crisp, and the stars were visible over the flat, dark valley, the fields all in shadow, the road running south and north without end. Above the door, the hand-lettered name was dark now, the neon off, but the shape of it was visible against the sky. The letters Earl had painted back in 1987, the name that had been here for 37 years, the slight wobble in the R that she had loved from the first moment she saw it, and had never asked him to redo, and never would. Ruth Carver stood in her parking lot and looked up at it for a long moment. Then she got in Earl's truck and drove home. The new year came. Ruth was 53 days into 69 by then, and she thought about the shape of the years ahead and found that she was not afraid of them, which was information she had not had available to her at 67. She was not afraid because she had stood against something real and had not been moved by it. She was not afraid because she understood better than she had before that she was not standing alone. On a Saturday morning in February, Cole Decker came in by himself, without the formation, without ceremony. He sat at the counter and ordered his coffee and his eggs, and ate in the ordinary quiet of a man who has somewhere comfortable to be. Ruth poured his coffee. He did not say much, neither did she. This was the particular quality that had developed between them over the months since November. The ease of people who understand each other and do not require conversation to maintain that understanding. At the end of the meal, he set his fork down and looked at the photograph of Earl on the wall. "Your husband built a good room," he said. Ruth looked at the photograph. At Earl in his white apron, his hand on the counter, his eyes paying attention to everything. "He did," she said. Cole left his tip on the counter and stood up and put on his jacket. At the door, he paused. "Wade's daughter is bringing her car in next Saturday. An oil change and the front left brake is pulling. Danny said he'd look at it." "Danny will take good care of it," Ruth said. Cole nodded. He left. Through the window, Ruth watched him mount his bike in the parking lot and ride south on Route 99 until the road bent around the irrigation infrastructure and took him out of sight. She turned back to the room. The morning was running. The chess players were at the corner table, their game in some middle configuration that they clearly understood, and Ruth never would. Doris Flagg had arrived with her book and her ladies, 5 of them today, filling the largest booth with conversation and the specific warmth of women who like each other and have been meeting long enough to stop pretending they are meeting for any purpose other than each other's company. Pete was in the kitchen working. Danny was in the back lot measuring for the service bay footprint with his notebook in hand, and the particular focused expression of a young man who has a plan and is working it. Ruth stood behind the counter. The coffee was hot. The light was right. The room smelled exactly the way it had smelled for 37 years. The particular combination of coffee and bacon and the specific warm undertone of a building that has been in continuous use long enough to develop a character of its own, the way people do. She thought about the morning Wade Steele had walked through her front door and changed the direction of what came next. She thought about orange juice and sugar and the way you know what you know when you have lived long enough alongside something to recognize it in its most dangerous moment. She thought about 2 glasses of juice and a hand guided to a mouth, and 3 teaspoons of sugar stirred into the second glass, and the particular calm that comes from knowing what to do when the thing that's happening is the thing you have prepared for without knowing it. She thought about what it meant to be the person in the room who knows what to do. It means you have to do it. That's all. There's no complication to it. You see what's needed and you do it, and everything else follows from there, or it doesn't, but you do the thing. She had done the thing. Earl had spent 41 years doing the thing in the room they'd built together. Now Ruth was the one in the room. She had been for 3 years, and she would be for however many more followed. And the room would be what it had always been, the place where the coffee was hot, and the biscuits were right, and the table was set for whoever needed to sit down. In May, Danny came to the kitchen table one evening with a folded letter he had been carrying in his jacket pocket for 2 weeks. He set it on the table between them. He had been accepted to the business program at CSU Bakersfield, the 4-year program, full-time. Ruth looked at the letter. Then she looked at her son. "The Bay is doing well enough that we could hire someone full-time to run it days," he said. "I'd be there evenings, weekends. The diner would still be, I'm not." He stopped. "Are you happy about this?" Ruth asked. A beat. Then, "Yeah, I am." "Good," she said. She turned back to the counter and picked up the coffee pot. Over her shoulder, "We'll talk about the staffing tonight." She heard him exhale, then heard him go back to the lot. She stood at the counter for a moment, her hand on the coffee pot, looking at the room, at the chess players, at Doris and her book, at the afternoon light beginning to come through the west windows, at the angle that would catch the pass-through counter in an hour. She thought about Earl. She thought about the way he had stood at the door of the finished diner on the day they opened 37 years ago, his hand on the counter he had built, and he had said to her, "We're going to be here a long time." He had not meant this as a boast. He had meant it as a fact, spoken with the quiet confidence of a man who has built something he intends to stand by. He had been right. She thought about a vice president of a motorcycle club walking through her front door in medical crisis and being handed 2 glasses of orange juice because she was the person in the room who knew what to do, and how everything that followed had flowed from that single moment of competence applied to a person in need without calculation or condition. Ruth picked up the coffee pot and moved into the room and began the circuit she had been running for longer than most people's children had been alive. And the morning opened around her the way mornings do when you have earned them, 1 cup of coffee at a time, 1 honest day of work after another, moving through the room that a good man built for her, and that she had built right back into what it always should have been, a place where people could sit down together and be fed without ceremony or condition, as long as the lights were on and the door was open. And the lights were on, and the door was open. Tomorrow morning, she would be back at 4:53, the lights in sequence, the coffee on, Pete at 5:30, Danny with his uncombed hair and his business administration precision that had become, over the course of this past year, something more than precision. Something that looked more and more like the particular confidence of a young man who has watched his mother hold something worth holding and has decided to be the kind of person who does the same. The chess players would come. Doris Flagg would come with her book and her ladies. Charlie Moss would come with his eggs and his $2 and his silence that said everything it needed to say. Gene Puckett would come smelling of dust and effort. The truckers along Route 99 would keep coming, more of them now than before, because a diner earns a reputation the same way a person earns one. Not through announcement, but through consistent demonstration, through being what it says it is every single time someone needs it to be. And on Tuesdays, Wade Steele would pull his black Harley into the gravel lot and duck his head at the frame and sit at his usual stool and eat his eggs and drink his coffee and sometimes say something useful and sometimes say nothing at all. And the sign above the door would be lit, and the coffee would be hot, and the room that Earl built would do what it had always done, what it would go on doing as long as Ruth was standing inside it. Hold the door open, set the table, pour the coffee, and be the kind of place where the people who needed a place could find one. That was enough. That had always been enough. The truck moved through the dark valley toward home, and behind it on the shoulder of Route 99, the diner waited for morning, the way it had waited for every morning for 37 years, patient and solid and ready. The hand-lettered sign above the door, with its slight imperfection, the small human mark that a good man had left on something he had built to last. It was still there. It would be there in the morning. It always was. The spring that followed was the greenest Ruth could remember in years. the valley taking on a color it only found when the rain had been right and the timing had been generous. The irrigation channels ran full through April and into May, and the fields on either side of Route 99 went through their changes from bare furrow to low shoot to the particular dense green of established crops, and the sky above them turned from the flat pale of winter to the deep blue that Ruth had looked at from the diner window her entire adult life, and still found beautiful every morning she walked in and hit the lights. The diner ran. The rhythms held. Pete got a small raise in April the 1st in 2 years because the numbers had finally recovered enough to make it right, and he responded to this with a single long grunt that Ruth decoded as genuine satisfaction operating at a level he did not intend to discuss further. She noted it and moved on, which was what Pete preferred. The service bay was building its own history. By May, it had regulars, not just the iron riders and the produce truck drivers from Route 99, but the slow accretion of ordinary customers that any reliable business develops when word moves in the right direction through the right communities. A school teacher with a Honda that burned oil. A rancher from the east side whose trailer hitch needed rebuilding. A retired firefighter who brought his truck in every 6 weeks with the thoroughness of a man who has spent 30 years trusting equipment with his life and will not stop trusting it into retirement. Danny handled each one with the same combination of competence and directness that Ruth recognized because she had been watching the same combination operate behind the diner counter for 37 years, just wearing different clothes and applied to different problems. The customers came back. That was the only measure that mattered. The young man Danny had hired, Marcus Webb, 22, studying automotive technology at the community college, turned out to be the kind of quiet, serious worker that a small operation depends on. He arrived on time and stayed until the work was done, and asked questions when he didn't know something, and didn't ask questions when he did, which Ruth considered the ideal ratio in any employee. She caught herself watching him from the diner window sometimes, with the same sideways assessment she gave to everything she was thinking about seriously. She thought, he's the right kind of person. You can't make that. It's either there or it isn't. It was a Tuesday in June when Cole Decker came in and ordered his coffee and his eggs, and ate with the unhurried quiet that had become familiar to Ruth over the months. And when he was done, he set his fork down and said without preamble that Garrett Locke had received a subpoena from the FBI in connection with the Holloway investigation, and had provided his testimony willingly and completely, and that the case was moving forward on both the contract fraud and the financial transfer angles. He said this the way he said most things, as information without editorial, leaving Ruth to apply her own understanding to it. Ruth absorbed this. She refilled his coffee. And Derek Holloway, she said, completing his community service at a food bank in Oildale, Cole said. He comes in every Saturday morning and stacks boxes for 4 hours. He paused. He's reportedly not terrible at it. Ruth considered this. Good, she said with the measured quality of a woman who has decided that rehabilitation, however humble, is preferable to the alternative. Cole finished his coffee and left, and Ruth stood at the counter for a moment, thinking about the shape that justice takes in the world when it moves at its own speed, rather than the speed you need it to move. It was almost never satisfying in the cinematic sense, the clean resolution you wanted, the moment of reckoning that matched the severity of what had been done. It was usually more like this gradual, procedural, bureaucratic grinding forward through the mechanisms that exist for exactly this purpose and are slow by design. It did not give you back the evenings you had sat at the kitchen table, making lists of what you knew and what you didn't know. It did not undo the night you had sat in a plastic chair in a police station lobby waiting for your son to be processed through a system that had been pointed at him falsely. It did not make those things not have happened, but it moved, and it was moving in the right direction. And the diner was open, and the numbers were better, and Danny was in school, and the drainage in the east lot was fixed, and the ventilation unit was new. and Sawyer Flynn was reading his paperback at the end of the counter stool. And those were the things that were actually in front of her, which were the only things Ruth Carver had ever found worth paying attention to. She picked up the coffee pot and went to work. The summer came in earnest in July, the heat settling over the valley with the flat authority of something that has always owned this territory and knows it. The diner returned to its summer rhythms, the air conditioning unit struggling through the lunch rush, the ceiling fans turning on all year as they always had, the afternoon heat pressing against the windows, while inside the room maintained its own separate climate of coffee and conversation, and the particular human warmth that a busy diner generates, independent of the weather outside. Doris Flagg's book club had become a fixture. Every other Wednesday, they took over the two largest booths and the corner table and spent 2 hours discussing books that Ruth gathered were not always the books they had claimed to be reading. The conversation having a way of moving from whatever the assigned text was toward the real subjects that mattered to each of them: children and grandchildren and health, and the slow renegotiation of what independence looked like at 70. The particular concerns of women who had spent their lives being competent in rooms that did not always recognize their competence, and who were now old enough to be done pretending that this was fine. Ruth refilled their coffees and listened to fragments of these conversations from behind the counter, and did not contribute directly, which was her preferred mode of participation in most conversations she found interesting. She thought about what she heard. She thought, this is what the diner is for. Not just the coffee and the eggs. This, the room where the things that need to be said get said among people who have known each other long enough to say them without performance. Earl had understood this. He had built the room the way he built it, with 14 booths instead of 12, and the counter long enough to seat 8, not because the math of the business necessarily required it, but because he had an instinct for the social geometry of how people needed to sit when they were being honest with each other. She had told him this once in the early years, and he had looked at her for a long moment with the expression he wore when she had said something he considered important. And he had said, "I just built what felt right." She had thought about that for 37 years. She still thought about it. Pete had his birthday in June, and Ruth made him a cake, which was not a tradition she had ever started, and which therefore surprised him considerably, which was part of the point. He stood in the kitchen holding the cake with the expression of a man who has been caught genuinely off guard by something and does not immediately know what to do with the sensation. He recovered by grunting once softly, which Ruth had long ago decoded as the specific grunt that meant, "This matters to me, and I am not going to say so." She cut him a piece. He ate it standing at the prep station with the contained satisfaction of a man who will not say thank you, but means it thoroughly. Neither of them mentioned the cake again, which was the perfect way to handle it. The summer moved through itself. More coffee, more eggs, more of the regular Monday through Saturday rhythm that Ruth had been running inside for so long it had become less a routine than a form of identity, the way the particular pattern of a river's movement over time becomes the river itself, rather than just what the river happens to be doing. On a Wednesday afternoon in August, with the heat pressing hard against the west windows and the ceiling fans working overtime, a couple came in that Ruth had not seen before. They were in their 60s, from the look of them driving a camper trailer she had watched pull into the lot with the particular care of people who have been on the road long enough to know how to park something unwieldy. They were from Oregon, it turned out, passing through the valley on their way back from visiting their daughter in Los Angeles. They ordered coffee and the daily special and ate in the companionable quiet of two people who have been married long enough that silence is a form of conversation. When they were done, the man looked at the photograph of Earl on the wall behind the counter. He had been looking at it off and on during the meal. "Family?" he asked Ruth. "My husband," Ruth said. "He built this place." The man looked at the photograph for another moment. "He looks like someone who built things well," he said. Ruth looked at the photograph. At Earl in his white apron, his hand flat on the counter, he had constructed with his own two hands, his eyes paying attention to everything. "He did," she said. The couple left a good tip and a comment card that said the coffee was the best they'd had on the whole trip, and Ruth put the comment card under the register with the other things she kept that were not documents and did not require decisions but were worth holding on to anyway. The fall came, again the valley's slow turn from gold to a quieter color. The harvest dust in the air, the irrigation channels dropping, the sky going that deep October blue that made the flatness of the land feel like a gift instead of a constraint. Ruth had been running the diner for 38 years now, which she noted on the anniversary, the way she noted most things that mattered. Quietly, internally, with the private marking of a woman who does her accounting honestly and does not require an audience for it. 38 years. The building had outlasted a dozen businesses on either side of it along Route 99. It had outlasted a recession and a drought and the passing of Earl and the slow attrition of the small-town economy that had closed 3 other diners within 20 miles. It had outlasted Grant Holloway's attempt to acquire it, which had ended with Holloway's company frozen and his chief ally indicted, and the diner's numbers actually better than they had been in 2 years. Ruth thought about this on the anniversary morning, early in the dark before the alarm, lying flat on her back in the bedroom where she had slept for 42 years. She thought, here is what I know. The things that are built right take the weather. Not without damage, not without the evidence of what they've been through, but they take it. They're still standing when the storm has moved on. That is what built right means. It doesn't mean perfect. It means the wobble in the R is still there, exactly where it was 38 years later, holding its position in the hand-lettered name above the door. She rose. She dressed. She drove the access road in the thick dark of pre-dawn, the headlights cutting through the ground fog that rose off the irrigation ditches on either side. She unlocked the front door at 5:15. She hit the lights in sequence, kitchen first, then the main floor, then the neon sign in the window that read, "Open," in red, and cast its familiar pink glow across the gravel parking lot. The diner had 14 booths and a counter with 8 stools, and 3 ceiling fans and a pass-through to the kitchen, and every surface Ruth had cleaned the night before. Pete arrived at 5:30 with his grunt and his nod, which meant the coffee was already poured and everything was running fine. Danny came in at 6:15 with his uncombed hair and his to-go cup and his business school energy and the particular quality that had been growing in him all year, the quality of a young man who has watched his mother stand against something real and stay standing, and has taken from this the clearest possible instruction about what a person is supposed to do when the situation requires it. Ruth handed him the to-go cup. He kissed her on the cheek. "Table 4, she said. "Already on it," he said. The morning rush built steadily. Every stool at the counter was occupied by 7:30, and 6 of the 14 booths were full. Charlie Moss ordered his eggs over easy wheat toast, black coffee. Doris Flagg arrived with her novel, which she would not read. Jean Puckett came in smelling of dust and honest work. And at 10 o'clock, a single motorcycle pulled into the lot. Sawyer Flynn came in and took the end stool and opened his paperback and did not speak beyond his order. Ruth poured his coffee. He met her eyes over the book. She went back to her work. And at 11:48, a Tuesday, almost exactly a year to the day from when this had all begun, Wade Steele pulled his black Harley into the gravel lot, dismounted with the ease of a man whose body had recovered its authority, and came through the front door. He no longer ducked at the frame, which Ruth had noticed 2 months ago and taken as a good sign. He sat at his usual stool at the counter. He looked comfortable. He looked, in fact, like a man who has found a stool that fits him and has no intention of sitting anywhere else. Ruth set his coffee in front of him before he asked for it. He wrapped both hands around the mug. He looked at the room in the particular way he had come to look at it, not assessing it, just seeing it, the way you see a place you have come to regard as your own, in the limited and honest way that public spaces allow for. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," Ruth said. She refilled his coffee. The morning ran. Outside on the shoulder of Route 99, the valley stretched flat and wide and golden in every direction under the deep October sky. The hand-lettered sign above the door caught the morning light. The slight wobble in the R, exactly where it had always been, where it would always be. The small human mark left by a good man on something built to last. The coffee was hot. The door was open. Ruth Carver went to work. Later that October, on a Saturday morning with the light coming in at the particular flat angle of the season, Cole Decker sat at the counter with his coffee and his eggs and looked at the room with the steady, unhurried attention he brought to everything. And then he said, without looking up from his plate, "The Holloway case went to indictment last week. Federal. Both the contract fraud counts and the financial transfer counts." Ruth set the coffee pot down. "I know," she said. "Roy sent me a copy of the filing." Cole looked up at this. Something moved briefly across his face that was not quite surprise, but was its first cousin. "Roy has your email address," he said. "Roy has my phone number," Ruth said. "He calls." She paused. "We talk about Earl mostly, sometimes about the case." Cole held her eyes for a moment. Then he looked back at his eggs. "That's good," he said. "That Roy calls." Ruth said nothing to this. She refilled his coffee and moved to the next stool. The conversation she and Roy Pendleton had been having since the spring had become one of the quiet regularities of her week, the same way Pete's grunt and Danny's uncombed hair and Charlie Moss's $2 tip were regularities. Roy called on Thursday evenings, usually when the week had settled into its end, and the particular kind of tiredness that honest work produces had made both of them more willing to talk honestly than they might have been at the start of it. They talked about Earl. They talked about the valley and the way it was changing and the ways it was not changing. They talked about the diner and the service bay and the things Danny was learning in his business classes that Ruth found more interesting than she had expected. They talked sometimes about getting older, which was a subject that neither of them had anyone else to talk about with the particular bluntness it deserved, the subject requiring a kind of honesty that only works between people who have known each other long enough that there is nothing left to perform. Roy was 63 and had 2 adult children who lived in other cities, and a marriage that had ended quietly and without rancor a decade ago, and he had spent the last 10 years working and writing and sitting alone on the bank of the Kern River on Saturday afternoons because he had found it the most reliable way to think clearly, which was a habit he had inherited from Earl Carver and was aware enough to acknowledge. Ruth listened to all of this on Thursday evenings and contributed her own equivalence, the particular shape of a life conducted largely in service to other people, with the specific privacy of someone who has never required recognition for this to make it worthwhile. They understood each other in the way that 2 people who have both loved the same person for a long time develop an understanding that has nothing to do with proximity and everything to do with the kind of character that love reveals. In November, Roy came to the diner for the first time since the July interview. He sat at the counter and ordered coffee and eggs and the French toast because he had heard about the French toast from enough people by then to feel he owed it a serious evaluation. He ate in the unhurried way of a man who is not on assignment, who is simply in a place he wants to be, and when he was done, he set his fork down and looked at the counter in front of him and said quietly, "Earl was right about the coffee." Ruth was washing cups at the sink. She stopped. She looked at the pass-through window where the morning light came in at the right angle. "He usually was," she said. Roy left a good tip and his phone number written on a napkin, which Ruth put in the pocket of her apron, alongside the Iron Rider's challenge coin she had taken to carrying with her every day, not as a talisman, but as a piece of information, a reminder of what the year had been, what it had cost, and what it had returned to her. She carried both of them together, the coin and the napkin, the weight of the coin familiar now against the worn fabric of the pocket. The fall moved toward winter in the gradual way of California falls, which are less about dramatic change than about a slow revision of light and temperature that you notice mostly in its accumulation, in the way November feels different from September without any single day having been the turning point. The diner ran through all of it, The rhythms held. The coffee was hot. The biscuits were right. Pete ordered a new set of grill pans in December, which he announced by leaving a handwritten list on the pass-through with a price written at the bottom and a single grunt when Ruth acknowledged it. She approved the expense and put it through Nadine for the year-end accounting and thought, 11 years and he's still this careful about spending the money right. That was worth something. That was worth a great deal. Danny came home from his first semester of full-time classes at CSU Bakersfield with the particular mixture of exhaustion and elation that real intellectual effort produces in someone encountering it for the first time. At full strength, the sense of having been shown a larger room than you knew existed, and being overwhelmed by its dimensions while simultaneously unwilling to leave. He sat at the kitchen table on the last evening of finals week and ate the meal Ruth had made without speaking for 20 minutes, which was the highest compliment he knew how to give. And then he looked up and said, "I want to build something. After school. Something I own. I don't know what yet." Ruth looked at her son across the kitchen table. She thought about Earl at the door of the finished diner on the first morning, his hand on the counter saying, "We're going to be here a long time." She thought about what it meant to build something with the intention of standing by it. "That's the right thing to want," she said. He went back to his food. She went back to hers. The house was quiet around them in the comfortable way of a house where two people have lived together long enough that silence is simply another form of communication, complete and sufficient. On a cold, clear Tuesday morning in January, with the valley floor glittering from a light frost that would be gone by 9, Ruth unlocked the diner at 5:15 and hit the lights in sequence and started the coffee and stood behind the counter in the first quiet of the day. She looked at the room, at the 14 booths with their vinyl seats that she had reupholstered twice in 38 years, at the counter with its 8 stools and the particular marks and scars it had accumulated from 38 years of cups and plates and elbows in the hands of everyone who had ever sat there, at the 3 ceiling fans, at the pass-through window to the kitchen, at the photograph of Earl on the wall behind the counter, at his white apron and his hand flat on the surface he had built, and his eyes paying full attention to everything in front of him. She stood in the room that Earl had built, and that she had built right back into what it always should have been, and she felt the particular quality that the room had in its first quiet of the day, before anyone else arrived, before Pete's grunt and Danny's uncombed hair, and the first customer of the morning, the quality of a room that has been doing its work for a long time and knows its own worth without being told. She thought 38 years. The diner was 38 years old, which meant it had been standing for 6 years longer than Danny had been alive, and it would likely be standing for many years after she was done standing in it, which was a thought she found not melancholy, but clarifying the way any thought about duration clarifies when you hold it honestly. Things outlast the people who build them when they are built right. That is what right means. She thought about Wade Steele walking through her front door in diabetic shock on a Tuesday afternoon almost 14 months ago, and the 2 glasses of orange juice and the 3 teaspoons of sugar stirred into the second glass, and how everything that followed had flowed from that single moment of competence, applied to a person in need, without calculation or condition. She had not planned to change the direction of anything that afternoon. She had planned to finish the lunch service and close up and drive home in Earl's truck and make a simple meal and sit at the kitchen table and do her accounts. Instead, the door had opened and the world had turned on a different axis, the way it always does when you are paying attention. She thought paying attention is the whole thing. That's all it ever is. You pay attention to the room you're in and the people who are in it and the moment that's in front of you, and you do what the moment requires with whatever you have. Earl had known this. Earl had spent 41 years demonstrating it in the same room she was standing in now. She had learned it from him, and she had been practicing it in this room for 38 years, and she would be practicing it in this room for as many more years as she had. She thought, "See you in a minute, Earl. I've got a diner to open, She straightened her apron. She picked up the coffee pot. She went to work. Pete arrived at 5:30 with his single grunt and his nod, which meant everything was running fine and the coffee was already poured, and Ruth accepted this with the wordless acknowledgement it deserved. Danny came in at 6:15 with his uncombed hair and his to-go cup and the specific energy of a young man halfway through a year of full-time university who has just discovered that the world is larger than he knew and is genuinely glad about it. He kissed his mother on the cheek. She handed him the cup. "Table 4, she said. "Already on it," he said. The morning built. The regulars came in their regular order and sat in their regular places and ordered their regular things, and Ruth moved through the room in her circuit, refilling and noting and responding to the particular needs of each table with the complete attention she brought to everything. And the room did what it had always done, which was hold the people in it in the ordinary dignity of a place that treats its guests as exactly that. Guests, not customers, not transactions, but people who have come in from the road and need a table and a cup of coffee and a few minutes of being somewhere that knows what it is. At 10 o'clock, Sawyer Flynn pulled into the lot on his black Harley and came in and took the end stool and ordered his coffee and opened his paperback. Ruth poured his coffee. He met her eyes over the book. She went back to her work. At 11:30, Wade Steele pulled into the lot and came in and sat at his usual stool. And Ruth set his coffee in front of him before he asked for it, and he wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the room with the expression of a man who has come to regard a place as his in the particular and honest way that a man can regard a place he did not build and does not own, but has been welcomed into fully enough to stop feeling like a visitor. "How's the clutch on Keely's car holding up?" Ruth asked. "She says it's the best it's been since she bought it," Wade said. "Tell Danny she's welcome back any time." "I will." Outside, the January morning was cold and bright, and the valley was wide and still, and the frost was melting off the fields as the sun climbed the whole landscape, going through its slow, daily transformation from the blue-white of early morning to the warm gold of midday. And the road ran north and south across it without end. Route 99, carrying its steady traffic of trucks and commuters and travelers. The same road it had always been carrying, the same people it had always carried. The people who stop and the people who don't. And the people who stop here specifically because they have learned over time that this particular place on this particular stretch of road is worth stopping at. Ruth stood behind the counter and looked out the window at the road, in the fields, in the wide California sky, and she felt the particular quality of a life that has been built right with the same quiet satisfaction that she imagined Earl had felt standing at the door of the finished diner on the first morning, his hand flat on the surface he had constructed with his own two hands, looking at what he had made and knowing it was good. She thought, this is the thing, this room, this road, these people, this morning and the morning before it, and the morning before that, and all the mornings that are coming. She thought, we are still here. She thought, we are going to be here a long time. She picked up the coffee pot and moved into the room and began her circuit, and the morning opened around her the way it always did, the way it had opened around her for 38 years. Warm and reliable and exactly sufficient. And the sign above the door caught the light outside through the window, the hand-lettered name with its slight wobble in the R, the small, honest imperfection that a good man had left on something he built to last. It was still there. It would be there tomorrow. Ruth Carver poured the coffee and went to work.